Writer Adam Hudson is here to talk about the process of gentrification in San Francisco and how some suburban communities are becoming impoverished because of the nature of tech capitalism. Hey Adam, welcome to Truthout Interviews.
Hey Ted, thanks for having me.
You know, your article for Truthout is called The Bleaching of San Francisco, Extreme Gentrification and Suburbanized Poverty in the Bay Area. Now, both of us live in the Bay Area. We both grew up here. To me, San Francisco is, and that's part of your story, San Francisco is a city that has always been pricey. I used to live there. I lived there for about 5 years, and it was expensive back in the 80s and early 90s. But now it's a little different. Now, this is a kind of city where it is so expensive to live that it is pushing middle and working class people out of the city completely.
San Francisco, for a couple of decades, has always been pretty expensive to live in, but now it's getting so expensive that even people within the middle class and upper middle class can no longer afford to move there, no longer afford to live there. I mean, for people who are poor and homeless, it's always been pretty expensive and unfortunately not welcoming to those groups. But now it's to the point where like people even who are within the professional classes can't afford to live there. The median rent in San Francisco is well over $3,000 a month, and this is for an apartment. Some of them are like within the $4,000 to $5,000 range, and rooms for $1,000 a month, like those are virtually non-existent. And it's even to the point where San Francisco has right now the highest minimum wage at over $10 an hour. Seattle might have it because they're on the way to passing $15 minimum wage for their city. But I mean, until that happens, San Francisco has a pretty high minimum wage. And even if you would have to make somewhere around work maybe 4, 5, 6 minimum wage jobs in San Francisco in order to make rent. And so that's kind of where San Francisco is. And evictions have shot up tremendously, and it's to the point where people I talk to in San Francisco, if whenever I ask them if they're being evicted and they say they're not being evicted, they usually qualify it with "not yet." And so that's how bad it is. That people who've lived there for decades, people who are from working class to even professional classes, they can't afford to live there. And there was a report done by journalist Darwin Bond Graham, and he did some kind of data analysis on this, and he pretty much kind of projected that if San Francisco continues on its current path, within the next decade or so, the city's population will be dominated by basically the richest 5%. Like people who make above $200,000 or more. And there was actually an article in the San Francisco Chronicle that it was a letter posted from a landlord telling a tenant that basically saying that if you don't make at least $100,000, don't bother living here.
You're talking about the way in which, if current projections bear out, that the character of the city will be completely transformed. The only people that can live there will be the very, very rich and people, probably just homeless people that have nowhere else to go. Right. But this leads me into my next question, which is something that I prefaced at the beginning. I said the word tech capitalism. And tech capitalism, when I read your article, this sort of terminology came into my head, and I thought, well, this really does kind of sum up the way in which capitalism has reconfigured itself, especially here in the Bay Area. It is a very exclusive type of capitalism, one that employs a very small number of people and people that can only do specialized jobs. Yet these companies like Google, like Facebook, like Apple, they make billions and billions of dollars, and they sit on this money. And this kind of money often buys power. And they've done this here in the city. Certainly Twitter has gotten a payroll tax deduction. But that kind of money also buys it also furthers the gentrification process. Right. It is a manifestation of that power, if you will.
There's been previous waves of gentrification. It didn't just start with the tech boom, but this recent tech boom, I think that's what makes this wave of gentrification, I think, much more intense, is that on the one hand, You have the recession. You have like the middle class, like pretty much gone throughout the country, including in San Francisco. But then within the Bay Area, because of our proximity to Silicon Valley, and Silicon Valley basically being located in the South Bay Area, it's the only industry that's really, really booming. So on the one hand, you have like everyone else really struggling, but then there's one industry taking off. And as you were saying, the all this money from the tech industry, Silicon Valley, has been allowing them to buy political power. And so when it came to these tax breaks, companies like Twitter, Zendesk, they threatened to leave the city back around 2011. And Mayor Ed Lee, in order to basically coax them to stay in, he offered them tax breaks. And those tax breaks like are going to cost the city somewhere like over 20 billion, maybe even $50 billion. They're 6-year long tax breaks, and they have to be renewed every year. As you point out, these companies, they make a lot of money, but it's not really trickling down, so to speak, to the rest of the community. It's basically benefiting this sort of like elite group of people within this industry.
It's that kind of exclusive capitalism, but it has its cultural manifestation in Google itself. I mean, if you've ever been down to Mountain View, or you could just Google it yourself and see pictures of the Googleplex, what it looks like. These workers are shuttled in very nice buses to this sort of, and you write about this sort of Elysium-like community. It's sort of a gated community where, you get free lunches, you can bring your dry cleaning there, you get a free ride to work, you got a nice place to work, you get massages. Why leave? But if you do have to leave, you can go back in your very nice bus to San Francisco. So you have that kind of exclusivity. So these cities like San Francisco, or I should just say San Francisco, is bending over backwards to try to keep these tech companies here. And also because, Google does have a presence in San Francisco, but their main campus is in in Mountain View. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that in order to do that, in order to keep that company there, they have to give them a large tax break of some sort. But none of this really benefits the wider community. It stays exclusive. So while you can boast, wow, we have Twitter, we've got Salesforce, and we've got, Google's going to come into the city as well, how much does it benefit the city at large? Are people getting jobs? Not really, unless you have that specialized knowledge.
When I was writing this piece, I was like, because I remember seeing the movement, like, what, this is kind of like what San Francisco is turning to, that pretty much poor people who don't live in San Francisco are dealing with like, poverty and increased traffic and lack of public transportation and foreclosures and et cetera. Whereas people who live in the urban core like San Francisco are living in a very nice, pristine community. I think people kind of get that. And the protests against the Google buses, as they're known, are not against the buses per se or the people who work at the companies per se, because I think there are people who recognize it like, look, like not every tech industry worker is like a rich douchebag, right? Some of them are, and they've made they're kind of all over the media now, but not all of them think like that. And people, I think, in San Francisco get it, but the Google buses, they're a symbol of that sort of class elitism, that like, hey, we get our own bus.
Capitalism has reconfigured itself in various ways throughout its history. But during the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the wealth seemed to be spread out a little bit more, and there were more middle-class people that were benefiting from a capitalist system than they are from this tech capitalist system. So, you had manufacturing, you had jobs that weren't being offshored to other countries. But one of the things that is occurring, and this is the other half of your article, is the suburbanization of poverty. Now, interestingly enough, we both grew up in roughly the same area. I mean, I lived in Antioch. You live in Pittsburgh. These two towns are really next to each other in the Bay Area. And they are, by and large, working class towns. At least when I grew up in Antioch, or at least when I went to high school there, it was definitely a working class town. Pittsburgh as well. And you would think about working class as people that had blue-collar jobs. Well, then that all kind of changed through the 80s and 90s. And instead of blue-collar jobs, you started to find people working retail to get by, or finding office jobs or whatever. So all of those blue-collar jobs went away. But what you talk about in your article is this suburbanization of poverty, that once people are pushed out of the cities, where do they go? And you pick up on that and you say, well, they go to a few places, and you highlight them in your article.
When people who get displaced from San Francisco, and you can even say it's happening more so now in Oakland, it'll probably get worse more in Oakland as the years go by. The people who get displaced, who can no longer afford to live in the urban core areas, they're moving to Antioch or further east to Stockton or maybe Tracy. People are moving there. And so what's happened is like poverty has increased in those cities. So like you see like more poor working class, middle class people leaving, and those like in earners, the population of them decreasing in San Francisco, but the population of like poor people is increasing in these cities. And displacement plays a role. There's also the factor of the burst of the housing bubble, which hit Antioch really hard. That also, like people who were, middle class and had homes, when they got foreclosed, they wound up, with less income and in poverty. And so gentrification plays a role in that the people who get displaced, who can no longer afford to live in the cities, are moving to suburban areas. And I think that sort of pattern, I think you can probably see in other areas. Like I was talking to a friend of mine who's from Europe, and she was saying like it's pretty much the same thing in Paris. Like the rich people live in the inner urban core of Paris, and the poor people live in the suburbs. And I think in America, it's usually been the reverse. The working class people, poor people live in the cities, and the rich people live in the suburbs with like, big, nice houses and mansion style houses. But now it's sort of reversing. Richer people are living in the cities, and poor and working class and more middle class people are living in the suburbs. And I think the reason why this poses a problem is that a lot of like nonprofit social services that help low income people, a lot of them are located in the city, but you don't have a lot of those services out here in suburbs. And so that poses a problem. So like if a poor person needs help with, just getting on their feet, like there aren't many services to help them out here as there would be in the cities, because that's where a lot of poor people live. There's also the issue of dearth of public transportation.
Transportation becomes a real issue. If you don't own an automobile, or you can't afford the gasoline to run that automobile, you're reliant on public transportation. And if the infrastructure for public transportation in these suburbanized areas isn't good, how are you going to get to a job?
Right. And then that means commuting. And that's what people do. And there's a big highway called Highway 4 that extends further east, like Pittsburgh, Antioch. That highway is constantly packed during rush hour. And so you're basically having people living in Antioch having to commute long hours, even longer with traffic during rush hour, to their jobs in Oakland and San Francisco. And not only does that increase traffic, but it also increases pollution. So when people argue for the tech buses, saying that, well, they decrease pollution, it's environmentally friendly, that's you can argue that to a certain extent, but there's also the flip side, like, okay, this leads to displacement of middle class, working class, and poor people. And when they are working, like let's say they have their jobs in San Francisco or Oakland or somewhere else, and they're living in Antioch, how are they going to get to work? It's either BART or by car.
The Bay Area's got some of the worst traffic in the country.
Yeah.
And so you have all those cars sitting there idling. They're going to put up a lot more pollutants into the air, more carbon emissions.
And I think like that's something that's underappreciated when people talk about gentrification. Like a lot of the focus is focused a lot in the city, and that's one part of the story. But I think the model of gentrification, which seems to be the model that a lot of cities seem to be pursuing, which is basically bringing more rich people in and developing an area, that's going to lead to more middle class, working class people getting pushed out to the suburbs. And if they don't have the public transportation and services they need, then it's just going to, in my opinion, it's just going to further entrench lines of racial and class inequality. And when people argue for gentrification, saying that like, hey, it makes this area better. Well, yeah, it makes it better for a certain group of people. It makes it better for rich people, and yeah, for them, yeah, it certainly works out. I mean, they have less crime. They have, they can walk their dogs. They have their yoga spas, and they have like their nice, fancy, expensive eateries. So yeah, for them it helps. But for working class people who've lived there the whole lives and having to move somewhere else, it's not that much better.
Well, we're going to leave it there. I'd like to encourage everyone to read Adam's piece on Truthout. It's called "The Bleaching of San Francisco: Extreme Gentrification and Suburbanized Poverty in the Bay Area. Adam, thank you so much for being on Truthout Interviews.
Thank you, Ted. It's a great discussion.
And that's Truthout Interviews for another week. I'm Ted Asregadoo. Thanks for watching.